Hi, my name is Kevin Jones, and in this talk, we're going to take a look at using the Enforcer REPL to allow us to test policy. So what we'll do here is use something called ALFA, which is the abbreviated language for authorization. And this is a DSL, a domain-specific language for defining policy. And we'll try out ALFA in this thing called the REPL. And you can think of this as a playground. And it's a playground for trying out policy that you want to create. The URL for the REPL is here. And you can also find this URL on the Identityserver.com site. So the REPL looks like this. It's a 3-pane setup. On the top left, this is where we enter the policy written in ALFA. On the top right, we can specify any attributes used within that policy to allow us to test the policy out. We can run that policy, and then the result of running that policy we can see in the bottom pane. So how does this work under the covers? Well, we'll go through that briefly here, but if you want more information, then visit this URL that's on the slide. So at Identityserver.com, you can go to the documentation for Enforcer. But essentially what happens, we're going to pass the policy that we see on the left in the REPL and the attributes that we add into the REPL just through a UI on the right-hand side into something called the PDP. This is the policy decision point. You can think of this as being the runtime that's going to evaluate the policy for us. When we pass in these attributes, they are mapped onto values that this runtime understands. And we'll see more of that a little later. And it's the PDP that then produces a decision. And we'll see in a moment that there are various decisions that can come out of the PDP, such as allowing access and denying access. So let's go and dive in and see how this works. So when you first go to the REPL, there's a default policy loaded for opening doors. So in here, for example, what this policy is saying is that this door access policy will only be considered if we have a resource type of door and an action of open. We have a rule for that called main door, which says that if the resource is the main door, then we permit if these conditions are met. And the conditions are that we have an employee and the current time is between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. And notice we also say that we deny unless permit. So if we don't permit this action, then the default behavior is to deny it. Within the REPL, we can change various things. So we can change the editor mode. We can change the width. This won't make much difference here because the screen's quite narrow anyway, but it's fixed width or full width. We can also change the font size for the editor. On the right, we can add attributes to determine how this policy behaves. We have a drop-down list for those attributes. And if I click on this, we'll see currently we display the attributes that are used within the policy. So the action, the current time, the resource type, and the role. So if we add values for these, then these are the values that will be tried against this policy. We can also click on this button and show all attributes. And if I click on the box now, we can see all the attributes that we might specify for a given policy. So if I run this currently, we have an indeterminate outcome. And notice that we have some diagnostics here. This tells me exactly what the policy is trying to do to determine whether we should deny or allow access here. If I go and specify the various attributes here, so the action is open, the current time I'll leave as now, the resource is main door, the resource type is door, and the role is employee. And if I rerun the policy, we have permit. But if I change one of these values, so for example, if I change the role to be, say, contractor and run the policy, then we get a deny answer, a deny outcome. And we can see here that the evaluated expression, subject role is employee, current time is between 8 and 6. This is evaluated to false. And that's why we get the outcome of deny. So we'll use this tool to build up a more complex policy, and we'll see how to do that and how to use this to test our policy. So the policy we are going to create is for the finance department. And I'm going to clean out the policy that's currently in place within the REPL. And what we'd like to do is to define a policy to specify who's allowed to OK purchase orders. So let's create a policy called purchase orders. Notice that this policy has no target clause, so it will always be evaluated. And notice that the REPL is evaluating the policy in the background. So we see errors live here. And the first thing it's telling us is that we declared a policy without a rule combinator. And the rule combinator tells us how to combine all the rules to determine whether we should allow or deny something. And there are a set of rule combinators that we can select from. And we can apply one here. And the default that we'll apply here just to test this out is permit unless deny. And what this says is that the result of this policy will be to permit something unless we explicitly deny it. And if we run this policy now, then sure enough, the outcome is permit. If we change this combinator to deny unless permit and run the policy, then sure enough, the outcome is deny. So we'll switch this back to permit unless deny. We then need to specify the target for this policy. And we do that by saying target clause. And the target for this policy is going to be a resource type of purchase order. And we'll specify the fully qualified name here. So that's going to be oasis.attributes.resource type. And we say this is equals, notice the double equals sign here, to purchase order. And we'll see in a moment that we don't always need to fully qualify this. We can use namespaces, like we can in languages such as C# and Java, to make our type name shorter. And we'll do that in a moment. So if I run the policy again, the answer is now indeterminate. And that's because the target clause is false. And so the policy is not considered. So on the right-hand side here, we can now see that we're allowed to enter a value for the resource type attribute. And the REPL's picked that up from the fact that we're using the resource type inside the policy. So this is the in-use attribute. If I specify the value here to be purchase order, this would be a value that's sent into this policy. So when we run the policy now against this set of attributes, it knows that it's running the policy against a purchase order. If I run this, it's now set to permit because we have the combinator of permit unless deny in place here. Okay, so what about this fully qualified name here? Rather than having to type fully qualified names every time, we can import a namespace. So here, I can say import oasis.attributes, and then I can lose the fully qualified name. And if I run this again, we'll get permit again. As we are specifying the target for the policy of purchase order, we're running it against a purchase order based on the attributes, and we have the permit unless deny combinator in place. So at the moment, we have a combinator and we have a target, but we don't have any rules. So the next thing to do here is to add some rules to this policy. When we create a rule, we use the rule keyword and we give the rule a name. So let's call this rule restrict access to employees. And then notice we're getting an error. And the error is that the rule has a missing outcome. It expects either a permit or a deny. So for now, let's just do deny. And if I run this policy again, sure enough, we get deny. Because we are now denying everything and everybody access to this resource type, access to this purchase order. So to fix that, let's add a condition to the rule. And the condition says if the subject role is not employee, to deny access. So to only allow access if the subject is an employee. Then on the right-hand side here, on the attribute, we can now specify the value for role. If we specify this value as employee and add this attribute, run the policy again, we now have permit. And again, if I change this value to say contractor and run this again, we have deny. So we're now applying this rule to this policy. Let me change that back. So we can see that we can base the rules around a given attribute value and then build conditions out of those rules. Okay, so we don't just want to allow employees to be able to create purchase orders. We'd like only managers initially to be able to create purchase orders. So to do that, we can add another rule. And these rules will then be combined. So let's create a new rule. And let's call this rule restrict creation. And again, the default result of this rule will be deny. And then we can add a condition, which is not role equals manager. So again, we're saying we want to deny permission unless the role is manager. So again, I can add a resource type here, and I want to add a role resource type, and that role is going to be manager. So now we have 3 attributes. We're saying that we want to test for the resource type of purchase order, and we're setting 2 values for role. So we're setting the user in this case to both be an employee and a manager. And if I run this, we have permit. And if I delete the manager role and run this again, we have deny, because the thing that's now being tested does not have the role of manager. So let me re-add that value. Now notice here, we've called this rule restrict creation. But at the moment, what this rule is doing is restricting everything around the ability to use purchase orders. So what I can do here is add a rule based on an action. And to do that, we add something called a target clause. So I can say that for the target clause, I want to specify an action, and that action is going to be create. So now I need to set the action to be create, as this rule only runs if the action is set to create. So I add the attribute for the create action and run the policy, and sure enough, the outcome is still permit. However, now, if I've removed the manager from the role and run the policy, we're now saying the action is create, and if the user is not a manager, then we should return deny. So I run this, and sure enough, the outcome is now deny. So let me add the manager role back in. Okay, so now we have a rule where only managers can create purchase orders. But what we might want to do is to allow employees to create purchase orders, but only under certain conditions. So for example, we might want to allow an employee to create a purchase order for a value of under 100. Whether that's pounds or dollars or euros, we don't really mind here. So for this to work, we need a couple of things. We need to add a new condition to our restrict creation rule. And that condition is based on the employee. So we want to say if the subject role is manager or the subject role is employee, but we only want to permit the action if the role is employee and the purchase total is less than 100. So the rule will look something like this. So here we're saying if the role is manager, then permit the action. If the role is employee and purchase order total is less than 100, also permit the action. But where does this purchase order total value come from? Well, we can define our own attributes within the policy. So we can define an attribute within the Acme Corp Finance namespace here, which looks something like this. So we give it a name of purchase order total. That's the name we'll use within ALFA. Then we specify some other values here, which are meaningful to the runtime. The PDP. If you remember, back near the beginning of this talk, we mentioned that we passed the policy and the attributes into this runtime, into this PDP. And we had to map values from the attributes into the runtime. Well, this is the mapping. So here the attribute that's defined as purchase order total to the alpha within the PDP belongs to a category, which is the action category, has a type, which is a double, and has a name. And that fully qualified name is finance purchase order total. So if I look at the add attributes dialog now, then in here, we see we have a purchase order total attribute. So if I set this value to be 101, say. So currently, we have both an employee and a manager set in the roles. So if I run this, the outcome is permit. If I remove manager from the role, we have an employee with a purchase order total of 101. So if I run this, we deny because the purchase order total is too high. And if I set the purchase order total to be 99 and run it again, then we have permit. So this rule is saying if it's an employee, which it is, and the purchase order total is less than 100, which it is, then we should permit the action. And indeed, that's what we get as the outcome here. So as well as permitting or denying actions, policies and rules can also emit events when certain things happen while the policy is being evaluated. And these events are known as advice or obligations, and they are slightly different. Obligations must be honoured, and if the obligation isn't honoured, then the result will be denying access. Advice is much looser. So failure to undertake advice will not change the outcome of the authorization. And you'll often see obligations used, for example, to provide auditing, and advice may be just used to provide messages back to the user stating why the request has been denied. If an application was evaluating the policy, then the application would provide the runtime to handle such advice and obligations. Here, we're just going to show how to issue advice and obligations. So what we're going to do here is to add some advice to the restrict access to employees rule, and this advice will just let the user know the reason that access has been denied. So to do this, we first need to define an identifier for the advice. And this identifier we'll put into its own namespace called acmecorp.advice. So we can add that namespace here. And then inside that namespace, we can add the identifier by using the advice keyword. So here we say the name of the advice is authorization failure, and the value of the advice is Acme Corp authorization failure. We can then import this namespace into our Acme Corp finance namespace, and then we can update the restrict access to employees rule. So inside the rule, we can say on deny and add some advice. And the advice we want to happen is the authorization failure. So what we're saying is that if we are restricting access because the role is just employee, then send out this authorization failure advice. So to test this, let's make sure all the attributes are correct. So we have the create action, we have the purchase order resource type, we have a purchase order total set to 99, and we have two roles. We have the manager role and the employee role. And if we run it, then we have the outcome as permit. If I remove employee as the role and run this again, then we have deny. And if I scroll to the end here, it shows the advice has been issued. And the advice that's been issued is this authorization failure from Acme Corp. So we can also associate attributes with obligations or advice. And these attributes can provide additional context. So for example, we can provide a message that goes along with this authorization failure advice. And we can do that by adding extra attributes to our namespace. So when we add these attributes, we add the attributes within a category. So within the advice namespace here, I first create a category, and we give this category a name of authorization failure cat with a value of authorization failure. And then we can add the attribute. So to do that, I use the attribute keyword and name my attribute. And in this case, this is going to be authorization failure message. This needs an ID and a type. And in this case, we give it an ID of authorization failure message, and it's going to be a string type attribute. And then finally, we set a category. And the category is going to be authorization failure cat. And then to use this in our on deny block, when we specify the advice here, we can add the attribute to the advice. So in here, we say authorization failure message equals and specify some message. And let's say you must be an employee to access purchase orders. If I run this again, we have a deny, as well as the authorization failure advice, we have the message as well. You must be an employee to access purchase orders. Now, there's no limit on how many pieces of obligations or advice you have in a policy. So we can also add a catch-all piece of advice here. And we do this within the policy rather than within a rule. So again, within the policy, we can say on deny. In here, we can add some advice, which again would be our authorization failure advice. To this, we can add an authorization failure message. Or we can just say, for example, access denied. And again, if I rerun the policy, we now get two pieces of advice. One coming from the rule and one coming from the policy. So ALFA is extensible, and we can extend it with functions. An enforcer ships with a set of standard functions that are defined by OASIS, and also some additional functions that you can find in the documentation. So to use the OASIS functions, again, we can import the namespace. And then, for example, here, rather than looking at the role for employee, we can check an email address, and we can check that the email address ends with the correct value. So we can say condition, not, and then we can say ends with, which is one of the functions from Oasis, acme.com, and we tell it where to get this value from. We can say subject.email. Oh, and let's make this at acme.com. And then if I rerun this, this is going to fail. And it fails now because our email doesn't end with acme.com. So down here, if I change my email, so from rocksolidknowledge.com to acme.com and rerun, then again, it now succeeds. And I can also now remove the employee role, run this again, and it still succeeds. So now rather than checking a role, we're being a little more flexible and now checking the given email that's sent in. So at the moment, we only have one policy here, but it's possible to have multiple policies, and those policies can be combined in the same way that rules can be combined. So for example, inside the Acme Corp Finance namespace here, we can use the policy set keyword to specify how policies should be defined together. And in the same way that we specify how rules can be combined, we can specify how policies can be combined. And we do that again by using the apply keyword. And in this case, let's say first applicable. And then we can specify the set of policies that are in this policy set. Oh, and we also have to give this policy set a name. So let's call this finance application. Okay, so to test this, let's go and clear all these attributes on the right-hand side. And we now see in this drop-down, we can run either policy. So we can run the purchase orders policy or the finance application policy set. And if I run that, we get an indeterminate result, as no rules or policy produced a permit or a deny. If we change the combining algorithm to deny unless permit and run again, we now get deny. Okay, so let's add some attributes. So we can add a resource type, and that will be purchase order. The action can be create. We'll add an email, and we'll add alice@acme.com, and we'll add a role. And the role can be manager. And again, we can run this, and we now get a permit. So the top level policy, if you like, the finance application, is running the purchase orders policy with the attributes that we've passed over. And as the purchase orders policy permits the action, then the finance application policy also permits the action. Okay, so we can also define policies directly within a policy set. So in here, let's try this. We'll add a policy called allow auditors all access. And notice this is defined inside the finance application policy set. And what this policy says is that if the email ends with @auditors.com, then just permit access. So to test this, let's take the email address and change that to alice@auditors.com. Let's make sure we're running the finance application policy, so the top level policy. And if we run this, then sure enough, we get permit. And down here, notice it's checking the expression ends with @auditors.com, and that is true. So this allow auditors all access policy is permitting access here. So I hope you've enjoyed this walkthrough. For more information, either email sales@identityserver.com or visit https://www.identityserver.com/product/enforcer for more information. Thank you.